Good evening. You're listening to WRPI in Troy, and the program is Peace Radio. My name is Don Drewecki. Welcome to the program. This week we're going to be continuing our series of recordings made at the 1986 Socialist Scholars Conference held at the Borough of Manhattan Community College in New York City. Tonight's presentation will be heard in its entirety, and it's a rather lengthy one, Israel and the U.S. Left. It's a panel discussion featuring Paul Berman, the drama critic of The Nation and also a writer for The Village Voice, Alan Willis, also a writer for The Village Voice, and Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT, whose views on Israel are not only well-known but very controversial. As I said, this is a rather lengthy presentation divided into two parts. First will be the actual presentations by the speakers, and then there will be a rather heated interchange with members of the audience. Michael Albert of the South End Press in Boston, which sponsored this particular panel discussion at the conference, now introduces the speakers.
Okay, perhaps we could settle down and try and begin. Welcome to the panel on Israel and the U.S. Left. My name is Michael Albert, and I'm from South End Press. We sponsored the panel. We are going to have the three speakers speak in order, and then we will have, of course, a question and answer and discussion period. I'll call on people for that, and we can, set the ground rules for it when the time comes. But for now, I think we should just begin. The first speaker is Paul Berman, who's a columnist for The Village Voice and a drama critic for The Nation. Thank you.
Comrades, the Middle East scholar Bernard Lewis recently contributed to the New York Review of Books some comments on what he calls the new anti-Semitism. In the current issue of The Village Voice, I use some but not all of those comments to make points of my own. I wish to resume and elaborate certain of those points. We must ask ourselves, why is it that Israel arouses around the world such ferocious hostility? Is it because Israel has been engaged in a very nasty border dispute with its neighbors, which has gone on for a long time, and in which its own actions have frequently been reprehensible? The description is true, but in what way does the nastiness of the dispute and the reprehensibility of the behavior differ from what we see in other disputes? For instance, between Greece and Turkey, Iran and Iraq, India and Pakistan, China and Vietnam, all of these being disputes that have, though bloody and horrendous, failed to arouse global passions. Does the hostility with which Israel is regarded stem from the fact that Israel is a white settler colony intruding itself upon the Third World? To describe Israel in that manner would be a cruel way to describe the fleeing remnant of European Jewry. But even if the heartless description were just, we may note that it long ago ceased to apply. As is well known, the majority of the Jewish population in Israel are themselves from the Third World, above all from North Africa, where they were indeed, in many cases, the original pre-Arab population. Perhaps the hostility to Israel arises from its trade with South Africa. I will cite Jesse Jackson on this question from the current Journal of Palestine Studies. Jackson forcefully condemns Israel for its South African trade, as do all of us here. But he adds, you always have to put the issues in the broader context. The broader context that he notes is that the United States plays a larger role in South Africa than does Israel. And the other Western democratic allies, Japan, West Germany, and the like, are involved. So I'm not sure, says Jackson, that it is healthy just to isolate Israel in that sense. Perhaps hostility to Israel arises from Israel's international arms trade, an ugly arms trade nobody will dispute, one that all of us condemn. But Israel's exceptional status in having such an arms trade is difficult to see. I quote NACLA's report on the Americas, their Sandinista foreign policy issue. The largest arms suppliers to the Third World are the Big Six, the U.S., the USSR, France, Italy, Great Britain, and West Germany, who between them account for 88% of all arms sales to the Third World. Some distance behind are the smaller Western arms exporters: Norway, the Netherlands, Brazil, Israel, Sweden, Belgium, Switzerland, and Spain. Somehow we hear about the Israeli arms trade with strikingly greater frequency than we hear about the odious Belgian and Brazilian arming of Guatemala. Perhaps hostility to Israel arises from the way it discriminates against its Arab citizens, and the even worse way in which it discriminates against Arab non-citizens in the occupied zones. We here in the Socialist Conference condemn this practice, but to be sure, it's not hard to go around the world finding instances of abominable treatment of minority populations. The Bulgarian treatment of Islamic Turks, the Berber practice in modern Mauritania of maintaining black slavery, which are grotesque, horrifying, and which, to be sure, we oppose, but which somehow have not become objects of worldwide obloquy. Not to mention the traditional Arab treatment of Jews. Perhaps hostility to Israel arises from the fact that Israel is a faithful hunting dog for the United States and does its bidding. But I need hardly comment that doggishness characterizes great portions of the globe. Perhaps the unusual hostility arises from the fact that Israel has displaced a large number of people. It is true, of course, that for decades the numbers of Arab refugees from Israel and Jewish refugees from Arab countries were roughly equivalent. But leaving that aside, the fact remains that mass displacement is a general characteristic of the modern situation, as we see in Africa and in Afghanistan and in the fate of the Crimean Tartars. Israel's uniqueness can hardly lie in the fact that it has displaced people. The intractability of the Palestinian refugee problem, perhaps that is the problem. I quote Bernard Lewis: "The intractability of the refugee problem is a consequence, not a cause of the political problem. That the problem was not solved, like others elsewhere in our brutal century, by a combination of resettlement and some repatriation was owing to an act of will on the part of the Palestinian leadership and of the Arab states. Perhaps hostility to Israel arises from the fact, as is sometimes suggested, that we expected of the Jewish state a higher standard. We expected something greater than grubby injustice and realpolitik. But surely we did not expect from Israel more than was expected by many people of communist China. Yet disappointment in China has not led to unusual worldwide hostility. Israel's pariah status is such that even now, its neighbors have, with one exception, refused to recognize it or speak with it. A refusal that does not date from the formation of the PLO in 1964, but from the formation of Israel in 1948. The refusal is absolute, as if Israel were loathsome beyond human tolerance, and as if this loathsomeness were evident and plain to all observers. And let us note that the anti-Israeli ferocity extends to many places, to large parts of the left in certain countries, even to portions of the left in our country. No one can be unaware of the special tension, the special electricity that enters discussion when Israel is mentioned. The ferocity even drives some of the more committed anti-Zionists, even in our own ranks, into bizarre alliances with the extreme right. In suggesting an explanation for this phenomena, I wish to point out a peculiar quality that has long pertained to the hatred of Jews. We think of Jew-hating as a dark, reactionary thing cultivated by retrograde, unenlightened people, a sentiment for dim intelligences in dark rooms. In fact, anti-Semitism has characteristically taken a form, one form among several, that views itself and is viewed by some people as enlightened. The sun shines for all that it may surprise us on anti-Semitism. The very word anti-Semitism, as Lewis points out, expresses that fact. The traditional hatred of Jews in Europe was religious. But beginning in the 19th century, people with enlightened opinions saw religious bigotry as backward and objectionable. They repudiated it. And those enlightened thinkers who nonetheless persisted in strong feelings about Jews embraced instead a modern, secular sort of hostility based on racial theory, which was the last word in 19th century science. They coined the word anti-Semitism precisely to connote the racial, i.e. scientific basis of their hatred of Jews. They were forward-thinking and well-educated, these 19th century anti-Semites. They would never have considered themselves retrograde or reactionary. Today, let us ask, how do the fierce opponents of Israel, the people who single Israel out for special venom, the anti-Zionists, regard themselves? People with enlightened views today look on anti-Semitic racial hatred as backward and objectionable. They repudiate it. Instead, they embrace a modern secular sort of hostility that is based on political theory, which is the last word in late 20th century thought. They style themselves anti-Zionists precisely to connote the political, i.e. enlightened basis for their strong feelings. They are forward-thinking and well-educated, these anti-Zionists. They would never in a million years consider themselves retrograde or reactionary. But still they bear an inflamed and disproportionate hatred for the one among the world's many sinning states. A law of anti-Semitic history corresponds to the seemingly progressive aspect. According to this law, what the anti-Semite felt yesterday, he accuses the object of his hatred of feeling today, thus always assuring himself of the modernity and progressiveness of his own ideas. Traditionally, anti-Semites harbored a medieval religious hatred. When that was abandoned by sophisticated thinkers in the 19th century, it was the Jews who were accused of harboring a medieval religion. The Nietzscheans turned against Christian anti-Semitism only to accuse the Jews of carrying within them the Christian virus. Anti-Semites took up racism, thinking that racism was scientific. When that was abandoned, it was the Jews who were accused of racial hatred. 50 years ago, sentiment among Arab nationalists leaned toward Hitler. Then Hitler was repudiated, and it was the Jews who were described as Hitler's heirs. When the Arab world was strictly reactionary, Israel was declared a force for Bolshevism. Now that a good many Arabs have gone Marxist-Leninist themselves, Israel is declared a seat of world reaction. Thus, at each stage of anti-Semitism's development, the anti-Semite can congratulate himself on the progressive aspect of his views. And this potential for self-congratulation is precisely the mechanism by which the anti-Semite fails to recognize himself as someone in the grip of an obsession. Of what does the obsession consist? Sartre defined it as a passion which precedes the causes or provocations that are said to give it rise. And this passion is the conviction that the Jew is hateful in his essence, not just in particulars. That is why the convinced anti-Semite cannot be converted by mere refutation of his specific beliefs. If one reason for hatred is found wanting, he will jump to another. In truth, he will never find any reason wanting. If the anti-Semite says, the Jews are avaricious, the level-headed person, the Democrat, Sartre calls him, will reply, but I know many Christians who are also avaricious. And the anti-Semite will respond, maybe so, but Jewish avarice is different. And this is fundamentally the reply given to any argument that Israel is merely ordinary. If you say, many countries deal in arms, the anti-Zionist will say, yes, but the Israeli arms trade is different. Many countries trade with South Africa, yes, but the Israeli trade is different, and the argument turns into nonsense. The most important remark about anti-Semitism made in the Marxist tradition is August Bebel's phrase, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. It's worth recalling what he meant. Bebel was addressing the 19th century workers' movement and its tendency to rail against Jewish bankers. His purpose wasn't to defend the Jewish bankers, who were as bad as any banker, but he saw that the workers who focused on Jews were cultivating an illusion. They were pinning the troubles of the working class on a visible scapegoat, instead of on the economic system as a whole. Anti-Semitism in the 19th century workers' movement did contain, in its singling out of some capitalists, a sort of social analysis. But it was a stupid analysis. It showed no understanding of how society actually functions. It was the socialism of fools. Today, around the world, anti-imperialists confront stupendously complex foes and difficulties. The international economic order, the weight of superpowers, tyrannies of right and left. and around the world are anti-imperialists who propose a stupendously simple social analysis. Their social analysis rails against one of the world's smallest countries. Stand up to denounce the perfidious policies of this small country, and partisans of the simple view will cheer everywhere with the characteristic ferocity, blithely unaware of how neatly they have fallen into the pattern noted 90 years ago by Babel. For in the modern world, in parts of the modern left, let us acknowledge, even here, in the enlightened realms of sophisticated New York and our own socialist gatherings, anti-Zionism has become the anti-imperialism of fools. The announced topic for this discussion is Israel and the U.S. left. I believe that there is a great deal that the U.S. left can do. We sometimes think of ourselves as lacking in power or influence. That is not the case. Attitudes generated within the ranks of the American left have a way of filtering around the world. One role we can play, then, much more than has been done up until now, is to engage in the struggle against anti-Zionism. We should engage in this struggle because anti-Zionism has been harmful unfairly to the people of Israel, therefore has caused the defamation of Israeli society that no one at a socialist meeting will wish to deny. We should engage in that struggle because anti-Zionism has worldwide and in our own ranks become a modern mystification, a novel, seemingly progressive form of blindness. We should engage in the struggle, above all, because in the modern circumstances where Jews of the Middle East are no longer defenseless, the ultimate victims of the anti-Zionist passion have become the Palestinians. For the anti-Zionist deep beliefs, the belief that anti-Zionism is anti-imperialism, therefore is part of the world historical movement to the oppressed, therefore has the force of historical inevitability. The belief that Israel is so revolting to gaze upon that in the end all will turn against it and destroy it, and therefore again, Palestinian anti-Zionism will ultimately triumph. The belief that Israel is somehow different from all other countries and therefore should not be accepted as a fact like other facts, these beliefs, the core of anti-Zionism, have mesmerized the oppressed Palestinians into their tragic version of defeatism. Defeatism as a maximalist position. Defeatism that becomes more radical with every new era of the struggle against Israel. We should oppose anti-Zionism because, in allowing our own ranks to participate in the obsession, we ourselves have contributed to the cultivation of illusion and fantasy among the Palestinians. We ourselves bear some of the responsibility, and every new instance of our own version of left-wing anti-Zionism only deepens that responsibility. We must struggle against anti-Zionism if for no other reason than to make ourselves, at least in a small degree, a useful party in the unending crisis. Anti-Zionism in this country lacks the kind of influence that is reflected in notable political power, but it does not lack a social or intellectual base. There is a base for it on the left, in the universities and the journals of the left. There is also a base for it on the extreme right. Nevertheless, American anti-Zionism characteristically regards itself as lonely, isolated, surrounded by enemies, misunderstood, universally assailed, but fortunately heroic and brave. This attitude is, on one hand, nothing but posturing and of no great importance. But it also figures into the bitterness with which anti-Zionists greet their critics. Anyone who has ever stood up to oppose the anti-Zionism of the left or the right can tell you that the reception is normally one of extreme derision, extreme sarcasm, and outrage. Comrades, the extremeness in these reactions is the problem. Thank you for listening.
Our second speaker, a senior editor at the Village Voice and a writer on many and numerous topics having to do with political activism in the United States, including the issues that we're discussing today, is Alan Willis.
If we're going to discuss Israel and the left, one of the things that really needs to be discussed is Zionism, which might sound obvious, except for the fact that Zionism is mostly not discussed but is more moralized about or polemicized about than really discussed. There has sort of been a fudging and discussion and debate, which more or less sort of defines a Zionist as anyone who supports Israel's right to exist, or simplistically equates Zionism with either the present Israeli government or Israel itself as a country. But in fact, Zionism is really none of these things. And I, for the purposes of this discussion, would like to define it fairly narrowly, because I think that's really the most useful way to define it, as a philosophy and a movement based on the premise that a Jewish national homeland is the solution to Jewish oppression, vulnerability, and alienation, and that Jews' relation to this homeland is or should be the central component of Jewish identity, and it implicitly defines life in the diaspora as essentially a negative phenomenon. I think that this is a subject that neither anti-Zionists of the left nor those on the left sympathetic to Zionism have really discussed adequately, mainly because Jewish nationalism does not fit into the conventional categories that the left uses. Anti-Zionists have made basically two arguments. The first, which is probably the most familiar, is that Zionism is a reactionary form of nationalism, an inherently racist and imperialist form. It's important, I think, to recognize that this argument has set the terms of debate on the left, not only between anti-Zionists and those who accept Israel's legitimacy, but among people who start with the assumption of Israel's legitimacy but have differing views and differing perceptions about who is responsible in what ways for the Middle East conflict and what to do about it, and who should make concessions and how negotiations should be carried on and so on. And I'll get back to this point. The second argument, which is heard very often by Jews and also by leftists who have been disillusioned by female separatism and black nationalism, is that Zionism should be opposed because it's nationalism, period, therefore inherently exclusivist and anti-democratic. Now, in some ultimate sense, I agree with this, which is to say I think that the nation-state is an inherently authoritarian concept, not concept but phenomenon, essentially based on the idea that a group of people can own land, and this gives them the right to, by force, exclude other people from this land or from rights to it or rights to the society which is built on that land. And I think this is fundamentally exclusivist and anti-democratic, and in my view of the social revolution that the left should aim for, ultimately nation-states will be abolished. However, there's something very peculiar about this argument as applies right now to the Middle East conflict. And one of them is that the conflict in the Middle East is not between nationalists and internationalists, but it's between two clashing versions of nationalism. The Palestinians want what the Israelis have, a homeland and state of their own. And the second thing is that in a world which is essentially run by nation-states, by huge nation-states, to be without a nation is to be terribly powerless and vulnerable, not to belong anywhere, to essentially be like an orphan in a system where only the family offers any kind of security or protection or validity. And it seems to me that leftists who want to criticize nationalism from a libertarian and cosmopolitan point of view ought to begin by criticizing the superpowers, not by small countries or peoples who are reacting to the situation that exists and does not look as if it's going to change in the near future, wherein the nation is profoundly embedded as the basic organization for society. The question one has to ask about Jewish nationalism, I think, is again related to the question the anti-Zionists are raising, which is, what is the particular character of Jewish nationalism? Is it better or worse or the same as any other kind of nationalism, or what is it? And here I think that we get into the problem of why Zionism is so hard to discuss, that the situation of Jews has been very peculiar, and the situation of Jews, of the genesis of Jewish nationalism is in some way unique. And I think in order to understand it, one has first to understand the particular nature of anti-Semitism, which is not simply religious persecution, nor simply racial ideology, nor simply economic discrimination, though it has been all of those things at different times. But it is essentially the creation of Jews as a pariah group, which on the one hand have never been allowed to fully assimilate into any country, and who simultaneously, it has always been demanded of them that they assimilate, so that they are resented at one and the same time for being different and in some way unassimilable. And at the same time, whenever they have tried to assimilate, there has been tremendous paranoia about them subversively taking over the culture and trying to really assimilate for their own ends. And the logic of this double vision of Jews, in which Jews are neither allowed to be different nor are they allowed to be the same as anyone else, is essentially the annihilation of Jews. And while the Nazi Holocaust confirmed this view, which of course it's easy to have in hindsight of the end product of the logic of anti-Semitism being the elimination of the Jews, I think there were many Jews who felt and acted on this logic before Nazism. And that I think the Zionist movement, a large component of the Zionist movement was propelled by this conscious or unconscious perception. And the confirmation of this perception, the actual attempt to annihilate the Jews, was in fact the precondition for the State of Israel to exist. I think fundamentally what's wrong with the argument that Zionism was merely a form of imperialism is that it doesn't take into consideration the history and situation of the Jews. That without the Jews, there would still have been a clash between the West and the Third World over the land and resources of the Middle East. But Jews would not have been in the middle of it. Anti-Zionists have sort of tried to get around this in two ways. One is by defining the Jews as Europeans. Unfortunately, the Europeans didn't see it that way. And the other way is by defining Jews as a religious group. And of course, neither the Jews have never seen themselves as purely a religious group, nor have the rest of the world ever seen Jews purely as a religious group. On both sides, Jews have been seen as some sort of people and some sort of entity. This is the side of Jewish nationalism that's peculiar to the Jews. But there is also a side of Jewish nationalism, which in fact suffers from and is subject to the contradictions of all nationalism. Jewish nationalism, of course, has its right and its left wings and all places on the spectrum in between. The form of nationalism that's currently ascendant in Israel is right-wing religious nationalism of a quite obnoxious and dangerous sort. One of the questions that arises is, was this inevitable? Was it inevitable that the right ultimately had to take power? And of course, both anti-Zionists and right-wing Zionists tend to think that this is true. Left-wing Zionists have fought and are still fighting, for their version of what they consider the Zionist dream of a country that is at once a Jewish state and also socialist and democratic. I do not believe that this dream was ever possible, because fundamentally there is a clash between some of the basic particular tenets of nationalism, and, as I said before, a democratic and libertarian vision. At the same time, I don't think that the right-wing nationalist ascendancy in Israel was inevitable. I think that different currents of Zionism could have fought themselves out in Israel for a long time, that the left currents could have had much more influence than they had, that Israel politically could have been a much more benign state, and why did it in fact happen this way instead of another way? I think one very important factor has been the role of the left. Not primarily the American left, but the international left. In isolating Israel and confirming the most pessimistic vision of the right-wing nationalists, they've in fact helped push Israel to the right and are continuing to do so. I think there's a mentality on the Israeli right, which again I think was confirmed by the Holocaust but not produced by it, which essentially sees the Jews as isolated against the whole world, and that one has a choice. One can give in and still one will ultimately be annihilated, or one can fight and if possible drag the world down with you. And I think that post-Holocaust right-wing Zionists are very much influenced by what they see as the humiliation of the myth that Jews went passively to the gas chambers. And they are not going to do that a second time, regardless of the consequences, and I don't think in their hearts they're really that naive about the consequences. I think it's a very scary kind of Armageddon mentality, and I think that it's increased and accentuated and has more influence and more of a hold on more people the more external events seem to corroborate it. I also think that the ascendancy of right-wing Zionism is part of a whole worldwide wave of fundamentalist reaction that's hitting everywhere, including the United States. It's also, I think, the product of an economy that has been so distorted by military, by being a garrison state for so long. I think how do we as a left sort of react to what is now, to me, seemingly an almost hopeless situation? I'm very pessimistic about the possibility of any kind of settlement happening, that everything seems on such a collision course over there. But I do think, and perhaps this is my bias as a writer, that the first step for the left in trying to sort out what we should do about this, what attitude we have to take to it all, has to be to have a better understanding of the complexity of the whole question of Jewish nationalism, and to put that into the equation.
And now here is Professor Noam Chomsky. He is introduced by Michael Albert.
A long-time activist and writer on many topics and educator on U.S. foreign policy, Noam Chomsky.
Well, there are many topics that I would like to discuss, but I'm going to keep these remarks rather strictly to to the topic of the symposium, the Israel and the United States left. That is, I want to discuss the attitudes expressed, in fact, towards Israel on the part of the U.S. left. Now, these remarks will have to be, first of all, less documented than I would like and more selective than I would like for two simple reasons. First are the restrictions of time. The second is that the left plainly isn't a membership organization. So you have to select what you think belongs to the left in some reasonable sense and what you think is important, and I will do so within the limits of time. As for documentation, most of what I have to say actually is I've discussed in print. I can refer you to sources later if you like, where you'll find the issues and the facts laid out in much more detail and much more precision and with explicit references given. Well, let me begin by saying a word about where I stand, just to help clarify what follows. There are two national groups that are claiming the right of national self-determination in the former Palestine. One is the indigenous population. The second are the settlers who largely displaced them. I've always taken these two conflicting rights each to be essentially valid. Of course, that's a conflict, and there are various ways one can imagine to settle the conflict, different ones at different periods. Since 1973, since October 1973, there has been, in my view, only one practical short-term solution, namely a two-state settlement on approximately the internationally recognized borders, in accordance with a broad international consensus, which includes Europe, the non-aligned countries, the Soviet Union, the major Arab states, the mainstream of the PLO, but it has been blocked by the United States and Israel, and is opposed by certain elements in the Arab world, though not the major ones. I will use the term rejectionism to refer to the denial of the right of national self-determination of Israeli Jews or of Palestinian Arabs. In doing so, I depart explicitly from the racist terms of American discourse, where the term is used only for half of this, namely to refer only to those who deny the rights of Jews. So, for example, Israel, both the Labor Party and the Likud, the United States, and major components of the American left, to which I return, they are not called rejectionist, although their rejectionism is so extreme that they even deny the Palestinians the right to select their own representatives in eventual negotiations, case in point, incidentally, being the program of the DSA, and typically across much of the American left, as I will point out. However, again, in the racist terms of American discourse, including most of the left, this is not called rejectionism, just as Arab terrorism against Jews is properly called terrorism, but Israeli or U.S. terrorism against Arabs is not called terrorism, even though it's vastly greater in scale and often has not even a pretense of retaliation. Well, again, I will depart from the racist consensus in this respect, and I'll use all these terms in their non-racist sense. As for the State of Israel, which is the only concern within the racist consensus in the United States, my assumption is that it has the rights of any other state in the international system, neither more nor less. Well, let me now turn to the topic of the symposium, having, I hope, clarified my own stand. Let's turn to the left, and I'll take several examples that I think are fairly representative and important. To begin with, let's take the New Left. Well, the New Left had many disparate elements. It's impossible to really generalize about it. So I'll concentrate here on a major segment of the New Left, that which is represented, say, by Ramparts or by Liberation, and I'll concentrate on the 67 to 71 period. Prior to 1967, there was virtually nothing to discuss, and after 1971, there's nothing that can very well be called the New Left. So that's a natural period to take. So let's take Ramparts. Actually, in print, I've discussed this in great detail, covering a lot of things, but I'll just give you some representative examples. Take Ramparts, which is a typical New Left journal, maybe the typical New Left journal. Their first issue concerned with the Middle East was in July 1967. The editorial position was, I'll quote, "There is no doubt as to the basic legitimacy of the State of Israel. It is unreasonable to deny the absolute right of Israel to exist and to use international waterways. It is equally unprincipled to maintain that all Arab claims are irrational and that they have no legitimate grievances in the Holy Land." The contributors to this symposium were Paul Jacobs, Michael Walzer, Martin Peretz, and I.F. Stone, all deeply committed Zionists. Notice that the stance was rejectionist. That is, there was no absolute right, or for that matter even partial right, of the Palestinians to national self-determination. Later on, this position was modified to include, I'm quoting throughout, I won't bother saying when, was modified to include a legitimate Arab quest for nationhood alongside of Israel's absolute right to exist in what Ramparts described as its egalitarian and democratic society, Maurice Zeitlin in that case. Well, in fact, this fairly well summarizes the positions expressed in Ramparts through the period I'm discussing, 67 to 71, and in fact that continued. The last discussion was in April 1975. It was an issue devoted to the Middle East. Ramparts, as you recall, went out of business just about then. This was an article by, there was an article by Avishai Margalit, who's a moderately dovish Israeli, basically Labor Party. It was written and published at my initiative, incidentally. And there was also an article by me, which was very harshly critical of the PLO and also critical of Israel's refusal to accept any Palestinian national rights in the occupied territories or even to allow pro-Jordanian elements to organize there. This was the Labor Party. As for Liberation, I won't run through it, but the story was about the same. The editors of Liberation also noted accurately that the New Left was keeping away from the issue, and in fact this is true over a very broad range. And the fact of the matter is that New Left attitudes towards Israel are much less interesting in themselves than for what was said about them. For example, by Seymour Martin Lipset, who wrote that the American New Left largely shares the pro-Arab terrorist views of European Maoists, Trotskyites, and communists. He's referring to the same period that I've just reviewed, 1967 to 71. To maintain this, he proceeds with numerous lies, which I've documented in print and won't go into here. Well, this blanket condemnation of the New Left, you can tell from what I just reviewed that it cannot possibly be true, and it is not. This blanket condemnation of the U.S. New Left could be considered irrelevant here, given the source, except for one fact. It appears in an anthology of voices, quote, from the Democratic left, edited by Irving Howe and Carl Gershman, and therefore presumably it fits within the framework of our discussion. I won't go on with it, however. Let me turn to Irving Howe's contribution to the same volume. This is several. One of them was a 1971 New York Times op-ed on Israel and the campus left. That he reprinted as the concluding essay. Here, I'm quoting throughout now, here he describes a complex of values and moods verging on the pathology of authoritarianism, a contempt for democracy which explains the turn against Israel by campus Guevarists, Trotskyists, Maoists, and Panthers who lead the assault against Israel not because of her flaws but because of her virtues, because Israel offers the best model for the democratic socialist hope of combining radical social change with political freedom. And Howe then goes on to describe in the New York Times, and then as the concluding volume of this article of this volume from the Democratic left, he goes on to describe what Israel would have to do to gain the favor of the New Left intellectuals in the universities. It would have to institute a bloody fascist dictatorship, and then we would have the following consequence, which I'm quoting. Everywhere the New Left rejoices. Brigades of youth from Scarsdale, Evanston, and Palo Alto race to Israel to help with the planting. The New York Review plans a special issue, and Jean-Paul Sartre and Madame de Beauvoir take the next plane to Israel, prepared to write 1,000 pages in 4 weeks on the achievements of the Israeli Revolution while getting the street names of Tel Aviv wrong. Okay, that's Howe's picture of the New Left, quote, everywhere from Palo Alto to Scarsdale. So different, you'll notice, than the working class blokes in the Dissent editorial office. Crucially, not one particle of evidence is cited, no arguments are given, no names are mentioned, except for the New York Review, Sartre, and de Beauvoir. And this device of avoiding explicit reference is crucial, since it prevents immediate exposure of deceit. In fact, the two lapses in Howe's diatribe illustrate the problem rather well. The New York Review was always strongly pro-Israel, and Sartre was honored by the Hebrew University in recognition for his support for Israel. As for Sartre's errors, Howe doesn't cite any, but he does illustrate the problem, for example, by giving the wrong first name to Yigal Allon. Now, this was quite typical of Howe's practice, for example, in a bitter attack on Dan Berrigan as elitist, arrogant, and self-righteous. Howe places him alongside, this is 1973, Howe places him alongside unnamed new leftists who are contemptuous of Israel because of its advanced social legislation, progress towards socialism, the kibbutz experiment, ebullient democracy. In this denunciation, Howe does not once attempt to deal with anything that Berrigan said, and his few departures from invective reveal quite astonishing ignorance about this model of socialist democracy. Since I've gone through this in detail in print, I'll leave the matter here. What about Howe's own views at the time? Well, they're impossible to discuss because they're simply incoherent. For example, writing shortly after the October 1973 war, he says that Israel should withdraw from most of the then-occupied territories, presumably means the Sinai, but he also says that it must be allowed to establish borders that would enable it to guarantee its own security independently of the United States or international guarantees. Well, evidently the 1973 borders didn't suffice to that end, which is in any event unattainable without a political settlement of the kind that he rejected, so the contradiction is complete, and the topic cannot further be discussed. Whatever his views on Israel may be, one thing about them is clear. They are thoroughly rejectionist. That is, Israel's existence, he says, is a major priority for everyone who cares about democracy, but the existence of the Palestinians is not. So that's rejectionism. As for the Palestinians, he does say something. He says that Golda Meir's position, namely that they do not exist, is, he says, inadequate. And there is an element of validity, which he does not elaborate, in some of the Arab claims, especially in regard to the Palestinian problem. He had nothing to say about Golda Meir's rejection of Arab peace offers, about her brutal practice in the occupied territories, her insistence on settling the northeastern Sinai after the inhabitants had been forcibly expelled into the desert with their villages bulldozed and so on. This apparently had none of this had anything to do with the ebullient democracy marching towards socialism. Howe also writes at this time, I'm quoting, "I have never been a Zionist. I have always felt contempt for nationalist and chauvinist sentiments." How this is to be reconciled with his other views, I leave it to you to figure out. The fact of the matter is that these views are so incoherent and so completely devoid of any argument or concern for fact that one must conclude that Israel is simply playing a symbolic role in the entire discussion and that something else is on the agenda. I think it's clear enough. So far it's been fact, now comes interpretation. My own view is that it's rather clear what was on the agenda. Namely, he was simply exploiting the overwhelming enthusiasm for Israel as a stick to beat activist elements in the peace movement and the left. And I think this may fairly be regarded as a counterpart to the position of the Anti-Defamation League that the real anti-Semites, I'm quoting, are those who give war a bad name and peace too favorable a press, who criticize U.S. policies on Vietnam and Central America, and commit other such crimes against the state. Well, going back to that same anthology about voices from the Democratic left, it contains other interesting articles. For example, an article by Alan Dershowitz, Harvard Law School, attacking Fauzi al-Asmar. He's an Israeli poet who was in prison under protective detention, in prison without charges for 15 months. He is a, quote, terrorist commander, Dershowitz assures us, on the basis of what he was told by the Israeli secret police. And therefore, imprisonment without trial is legitimate. Incidentally, Israel has since abandoned the charge, the pretense that this was true, and Fauzi is now free to enter the country without disturbance from his American exile. But I simply ask you to imagine how we'd react to an article by some passionate American communist who goes to Russia and is told by the KGB that Yuri Orlov is a terrorist commander, and on the basis of that information writes an article saying that his detention is legitimate. But in the case of Israel, the exact similar practice becomes a voice from the democratic left. The anthology also contains an essay by Michael Walzer, another voice from the democratic left. He, too, is contemptuous of unnamed Americans, never names them, who, quote, disdain Jewish aspirations to statehood, and he tells us that a democratic secular state already exists in substance in Israel. Now, this democratic secular state, he says, must be, quote, a nation of Jews. What about the 15%, now larger than 15% minority of Arab citizens? No problem. Those groups that are, quote, marginal to the nation can be helped to leave. That, he says, will smooth their problems, as in the case of the French in Algeria. Emigration is the private equivalent of secession. You'll recognize this as essentially the position later developed by the racist Rabbi Kahana, who also wants to help Arabs leave because they are marginal to the nation. Now, Kahana at least has the honesty to stress that there's a flat contradiction between democratic principles and the official concept of Israel as, quote, the sovereign state of the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora, not the state of its citizens. Thus, it is my state, but not the state of its Arab citizens. And this doctrine is not at all abstract. It is realized, for example, in the fact that more than 90% of the land is effectively controlled by an organization which, by law, is committed to work for the benefit of, quote, people of Jewish race, religion, and origin. Much of the development budget is in the hands of a similar organization, one of the devices that have been developed to ensure a vast social, economic, and political gulf between Arab and Jewish citizens. However, none of this, keeping to our topic now, none of this affects Israel's status as an ebullient democracy advancing towards socialism. Walzer, in fact, assures us that he knows of no legal segregation in Israel, surely nothing comparable to what we find in the United States. That is, he seems to be telling us that in the United States, Jews and blacks are legally excluded from 92% of the country, which is controlled by an organization which is obligated to work by law for the benefit of white Christians, along with half the development budget. In fact, the situation in the United States must be even worse than that, since he says that Israel has nothing comparable to what we find in the United States. Well, let's quickly turn to more recent years. There's much to say in between. In May 1982, Howe reviewed a book by the Israeli Druze journalist Rafik Halabi. This book recounted some very long, familiar tales of Israeli oppression in the occupied territories. And to Howe, this was disturbing news in 1982. He blamed it on Menachem Begin, though, as anyone who knows anything about the situation is aware, some of the worst days were under the Labor Party rule that he was extolling while denouncing the New Left everywhere. Howe was particularly concerned that Begin's policies would, quote, threaten the Jewish character of Israel, which is perhaps a curious stand for someone who's never been a Zionist and feels contempt for nationalist sentiments. In the same context, Howe speaks of what he calls the underpopulated Galilee, to which Israel's settlement efforts should be directed. Now, here we have to be a bit careful. The Galilee is not underpopulated by people. Rather, the government is concerned that too few of the many, many people in the Galilee are Jews, Jewish. There are numerous Arab citizens, though many fled or were forcibly expelled in 1948 and again in 1956. They're cooped up in villages where they're not allowed to have building permits or whatever. They're barred from the national lands, much of it expropriated from Arab villages. The Labor government, the ebullient democracy marching towards socialism, established the program of what they called Judaization of Galilee, kind of like Christianization of New York, and its Minister of Interior issued a notorious racist memorandum, the Koenig's Memorandum, to deal with the problem of undermining by undermining Arab social, economic, and political life, reducing educational opportunities for Arabs, encouraging their immigration, and so on. He remained as Labor Party minister after this appeared publicly. Recall again, this was the Labor government. Since Howe describes himself as an ardent supporter of Israel, and particularly of the Labor Party, he presumably finds nothing objectionable here, as his reference to the underpopulated Galilee indicates. Howe's only comments in these matters have been diatribes, which I've already sampled, against generally unnamed critics on the left who have attempted to call attention to some facts that would be regarded as a scandal anywhere else. Israel's invasion of Lebanon, which aimed to destroy the social and political base of the Palestinians in exile there, and thus to expedite the takeover of the occupied territories, that did evoke a certain response on the U.S. left. Michael Walzer, for example, approved of it. He wrote in September, after the war, "I certainly welcome the political defeat of the PLO, and I believe that the limited military operation required to inflict that defeat can be defended under the theory of just war, including, apparently, the savage bombardment of defenseless Beirut with some 6,000 civilian casualties, the barbaric treatment of prisoners, which was amply documented in Israeli publications but ignored here." As far as I'm aware, I may have missed something, but as far as I can find out, Irving Howe said nothing in print until after the Sabra Shatila massacres, which, recall, were a month after the war ended. He then hastened to dissociate himself from the massacre with 3 statements in the New York Times in 2 days, and he explained his opposition to Begin and Sharon and his support for what he called the liberal Zionism of Chaim Weizmann. He fails to mention that the policies that he rejects were initiated and later supported by the Labor Party, including the invasion of Lebanon, the party of which he was an ardent supporter. And he doesn't mention that Weizmann's liberal Zionism had been eliminated in favor of Ben-Gurion's militant Zionism in 1946, as he could have learned, for example, from Michael Bar-Zohar's official biography of Ben-Gurion. The left in general hardly distinguished itself during the Lebanon War. The Israeli invasion was excluded from the huge disarmament demonstration at the United Nations in June 1982, although it was then bringing the world very close to nuclear war. The Santa Monica City Council, which was controlled by Democratic Socialists, passed a resolution, I think it's the only one in the country, to pass a resolution supporting the invasion. It also challenged the appointment of George Shultz as Secretary of State because it thought he might not be sufficiently pro-Israel. And this, he said, was the Santa Monica City Council said was a danger, quote, at such a grave time in Israel's existence, namely while Israel was demolishing the Palestinians and much of Lebanon in a U.S.-supported war of aggression. Lebanese opinion was excluded, as far as I'm aware, totally from left journals, just as scrupulously as it was from the New York Times, and so on. Much the same has been true since. For example, I can find little expressed concern over Israel's extensive terrorism in Lebanon to this day, and little recognition of its role in eliciting what the civilized West calls terrorism, which is a very small margin of contemporary terrorism. Similarly, I have been able to detect no interest here in the revival of torture in Israel in the prisons, the revival of preventive detention, the revival of expulsion in violation of international law. This revival is since the Labor government came into power. These were practices common under the earlier Labor government, which declined under Begin. Some of them, in fact, stopped under Begin, but are now continuing again. But if there is concern over here, I'm unable to detect it. Well, let me turn finally to a current example this week in the Village Voice. I didn't realize that Paul Berman would already discuss it, but I will just simply read what I have written about it. Here, Paul Berman denounces what he calls the modern left, even here in the enlightened realms of sophisticated New York, and he denounces this modern left for its anti-Zionism, which is a species of anti-Semitism, and so on in the familiar vein. Again, if you check, you'll notice that not one name is mentioned. The evidence is zero, in accordance with the useful convention that I mentioned earlier. No evidence is required when one is denouncing critics of the Holy State. He cites with approval Bernard Lewis's claim in the New York Review that the Arabs, I'm quoting now, have never veered from their declared intention not merely to defeat, but utterly to destroy Israel and to wipe it off the map. Well, since this is a theological doctrine, facts are again irrelevant. So, for example, we need not concern ourselves with Sadat's 1971 offer of a full peace treaty offering nothing to the Palestinians on the international border, and in fact exactly in accord with American official opinion at the time, the American official position at the time. This was rejected by Israel and by the United States. We need not concern ourselves with similar offers from Jordan at the same time, or with a 1976 proposal for a peaceful two-state settlement on the international borders with international guarantees, etc., presented to the United Nations by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, backed by the PLO, and according to Israel's president, then UN ambassador, prepared by the PLO, vetoed by the United States in the UN Security Council, and of course vigorously opposed by Israel. And we need not concern ourselves with a long series of similar offers, many of them quite in accord with the international consensus, blocked by U.S.-Israeli rejectionism, incidentally with the support of the left in the United States. Now, Paul Berman tells us, quoting Lewis, that the Palestinian refugee problem is a consequence, not a cause, of this alleged unwavering commitment to destroy Israel, which exists independent of the facts. If it were not for Arab anti-Semitism, the problem would be solved by, quote, resettlement and some repatriation. For the record, Israel has always rejected repatriation in violation of the solemn commitment it undertook in 1948 as the condition for its admission to the United Nations. Jews, in other words, are entitled to remember Jerusalem for 2,000 years and entitled to return, displacing the indigenous population, but Palestinians are to forget their homeland after a generation and go somewhere else. Anywhere will do. For example, to be concrete, the inhabitants of the village of Duaima, who were expelled from their undefended village in the course of the land clearing operations in October 1948, with several hundred slaughtered by the Haganah, the Israeli Defense Forces, which were pursuing their fabled vocation of purity of arms, for which they are constantly lauded across left and right in the United States. If these people in Duaima want to return home, or to what is left of home, that proves they're anti-Semites. Suppose that someone dares to object to Israel's services to the U.S. and the U.S. use of Israel for this purpose in repayment for U.S. rejectionism and anti-Arab racism. So, for example, to Israel's quite crucial contribution to implementing near genocide in Guatemala, or to supplying Somoza with close to 100% of his arms while he was massacring 50,000 people. Well, if someone in the United States objects to the U.S. use of Israel for these purposes and to Israel's glad, happy agreement, then this objection is, quote, the anti-imperialism of fools, rank anti-Semitism. As in the case of Irving Howe and Michael Walzer, and many others I should say, all problems of fact and evidence and argument and political analysis can be dismissed by sneers and by what Howe calls the sour apothegm, namely, in the warmest of hearts, there's a cold spot for the Jews. Facts are therefore unnecessary, thought is unnecessary, everything is just anti-Semitism, we can forget what actually happened, or any question of either moral values or political fact. It's all just anti-Semitism. Now, the fact is that the left has a lot to answer for in this domain. It has played a very significant role, as this indicates, and the full record indicates it more fully. It's played a very significant role in enhancing the torment of the Palestinians and also the torment of the victims of U.S. violence elsewhere, as, say, in Guatemala and Central America in general. It has also played a significant role in furthering the moral degeneration and the ultimate destruction of Israel, and also in repeatedly bringing the world to the brink of superpower confrontation and nuclear war. The Israeli doves have commonly accused the American Jewish community of what they call Stalinism. They cast their net too narrowly, but one can certainly see exactly what they mean.
That was Noam Chomsky speaking on the topic of Israel and the U.S. left at the Borough of Manhattan Community College on April 20th, 1986. He was part of a panel discussion entitled Israel and the U.S. Left, sponsored by South End Press in Boston. After this brief timeout for station identification and announcements, we'll return with the rather heated interchange between Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Berman and members of the audience. This is Peace Radio. You're listening to Peace Radio here on WRPI. And now let us go back to the main theater at the Borough of Manhattan Community College for the audience discussion section of the topic Israel and the U.S. Left. I might add here that much of the discussion with the audience does not center on the actual topic of Israel and the U.S. Left, but involves instead the recent debate between Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Berman in the pages of the Village Voice concerning Mr. Chomsky's defense of the French professor Robert Faurisson. Let's go now to the audience discussion section.
Okay, we'll have questions and discussions. If you could please try to direct your questions if you wish somebody in particular to answer, and also please try to keep them as brief as possible, and I will try to limit people to an absolute maximum of 1 minute, but there's no need to go that long if you can help it. Thank you. Yeah?
Don't you think we should
Respond to each other?
we should get a chance to respond?
Well, if you want, I thought that would happen. It's perfectly okay with me. If you want that, that's fine. Okay, I thought they would do that in context of your questions. Go ahead. All right, cool. 2 minutes each.
I don't know, just a few minutes.
All right, look, let's get something clear. It is perfectly clear that whatever we do, somebody's going to be annoyed. That's perfectly clear because we all disagree about the exact procedures we should follow. Nothing will be followed coherently unless we just act and move forward. It seems reasonable. We'll limit it to a minute apiece to respond. If people want to hear more response, all they need to do is ask a question that leads to it. Right? That will generate response between the panelists. All right? So let's just have a brief response, especially since there were direct comments referring to each other, and then we'll go to the floor. Okay?
A lot of people were laughing merrily at Noam's depiction of the political situation. But really, when you think about it, what could be more absurd? Think back. A lot of people here were in SDS in the late 60s and early 70s. Do you remember that militant pro-Israel spirit that was filling up the New Left? Think of the left-wing journals. We are the readers and writers of the left-wing journals. How many of them are filled with the militant pro-Israel spirit that Noam attributes as the position of the American left? He has cited particular writers. He cited Martin Peretz for his pro-Israel position within the New Left. That's kind of absurd. The fact is, there is an anti-Zionist position within the left, but it's not the majority position. It's not the main position. People may laugh merrily at Noam's description, but it just doesn't jibe with what one knows as the left. It doesn't even jibe with this room. Then he went on to talk about Irving Howe. Irving Howe was supposedly the militant Zionist or a militant non-Zionist Zionist in his description. How many of you actually read Dissent magazine? How many of you actually see what appears in the pages of that magazine? What appears in the pages of that magazine is, yes, a commitment to Israel's continued existence, but also an unending series of articles attacking the drift in Israeli society, attacking the turn to the right. Well, the description of this in Noam's speech is just a complete distortion of what actually exists. Irving Howe was said to have had no or minimum position in the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Quite the opposite is the case. Everybody in New York knows that he was running around organizing petitions and meetings to condemn the invasion. The entire description is off. The same thing is true even of Noam's description of my little article, which is in the Current Voice. It's unbelievable. Anybody can check it. I'm said in there to say that all of the Arab states have refused to speak with Israel, but quite right there in the pages of the thing it says with one exception. Just as when I repeated that same sentence in my talk a minute ago, obviously referring to Egypt. Then with the same scorn dripping from every sentence, he insists that it's just a complete departure from reality to say that the Arabs have refused, that the Arabs minus Egypt have refused to accept the existence of Israel. What can I say? I wasn't aware that the PLO charter had been dropped and abandoned. What are we to think of this? This kind of discussion gets us nowhere. What it does represent is what I discussed in my speech, an insistent, enraged, derisive, sarcastic distortion of what in fact has been the situation.
Let me repeat the facts and recall that these are facts. If you want an exact reference, I'll give them to you. I discussed the New Left from 1967 to 1971 for reasons I mentioned. After that, you can't talk about a New Left in any organized form, which is why everyone who talks about the New Left refers to it up to about 1971, and for Israel that means from 67. I discussed ramparts and liberation. And everything in Ramparts and Liberation, not Martin Peretz's article, which I didn't quote, but everything in Ramparts and Liberation conforms to what I described. Every pamphlet published by the New England Free Press, one of the leading distributors of New Left pamphlets, conforms to what I described. Everything proposed by the Africa Research Center, and in fact by a vast number of other groups. If you want documentation, I'll refer to it. I also referred to dissent and the DSA. Up till today, in fact, and I think that that is a fair except it happened to be accurate. If you think those quotes are wrong, look them up. You'll notice what the response was. The response was that dissent contains criticism of Israel's turn to the right. Exactly my point throughout. As I said maybe a dozen times, the criticism is of Begin, but it's support for the ebullient democracy of the Labour Party, in which the practices that I described were initiated, carried out very brutally, and in fact often more brutally than Begin. This is the kind of Stalinism that I'm referring to. This discussion within the entire range that I've mentioned so far is rejectionist. That is, it accepts the racist consensus of American discourse, which gives the absolute right of existence to Israel in Rampart's terms, but says the Arabs, the indigenous population, have some kind of qualified right. So, for example, in the DSA program on Israel, which is in fact one of the best on the left from my point of view, it says the Palestinians have the right for selected non-rejectionist elements to participate in negotiations. But according to that logic, nobody in any Israeli government should be allowed to participate because they are fully rejectionist. The Labour Party still maintains the position expressed by President Chaim Herzog that no one can be a partner with us in the land that has been holy to us for 2,000 years. Same view expressed by Golda Meir and many others. However, the DSA doesn't say that Israel, only those Israelis who abandon rejectionism, you can find maybe 5% somewhere, that only those are allowed to participate. Rather, this is a position for the Arabs, and this is across the board. As for Howe's objections to the Lebanon War, you remember I said maybe I've missed something, but I would still like to see it. I checked everything I could find in print, including the New York Times index, and I found nothing until after the Sabra Shatila affair, when the thing that appeared that I described. I did find something prior to that in May 1982. That was the article I quoted from, blaming Begin and Sharon for the Labour Party policies that he'd supported, and talking about the underpopulated Galilee in the manner that I described. As to the Berman's claim that I misquoted him, let me quote in full. As I mentioned, he's quoting Bernard Lewis. You can look it up. He says, he talks about the bitterest of conflicts. He lists them. They have never involved total non-recognition of one side by the other, the total refusal of dialogue, the declared intention not merely to defeat, but utterly to destroy the adversary state and wipe it off the map. Then goes on a discussion of the reason for this unique hostility, no qualifications. I quoted it precisely, accurately. Now, the reference to Egypt is a little deceptive. If I had time, I would have gone into this, but in the American propaganda system, which is reiterated by the left, it is recognized that in November 1977, Sadat became a man of peace after he had tried to destroy Israel in 1973. He became a man of peace, in fact, a great man who we're supposed to love, and that was a unique departure from the Arab consensus, which I quote again, not only to defeat, but utterly to destroy the adversary state and wipe it off the map. Remember, that's a declared intention. Well, as I mentioned, it is not Sadat in 1977 who departed from this declared intention. Rather, it was Sadat in 1971, 6 years earlier, with a proposal that offered nothing to the Palestinians. It was the PLO in for example, January 1976, with a proposal which you can read in the New York Times on January 27, 1976, introduced by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, prepared by the PLO, according to Israel, and plainly backed by the PLO, calling for a peaceful two-state settlement on the pre-June 1967 borders with international guarantees, and in fact the entire rhetoric of UN 242, and a long list of proposals since, which I've discussed. Those happen to be the facts.
Okay, we'll now take questions from the floor.
Why did Mr. Chomsky legitimize a Nazi who wrote the book that the Holocaust did not happen by writing an introduction to this Nazi book?
The question is like, why did you stop beating your wife? I didn't write an introduction to any book by any pro-Nazi, nor did I legitimate any pro-Nazi. The facts of the matter are as follows. There is, which you know, I am sure, if you're literate, but which you, like many other people, including some up here, choose to deny for your own purposes. The facts are very straightforward. There's a professor in France, or was a professor in France, Robert Faurisson, who was a professor of French literature at the University of Lyon. He wrote several pamphlets in which he denied the existence of gas chambers. He also said that he also stated that he was explicitly anti-Nazi. He praised the people who fought the good fight against the Nazis. He praised the heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto and so on. He also claimed that there were no gas chambers. That aroused a series of protests, and the university suspended him from teaching on the grounds that it could not protect him from violence. To my knowledge, there was one objection to that in France by a right-wing, conservative, not really right-wing, mainstream conservative historian named Alfred Grosset, who pointed out that people who had denied the existence of the Gulag had never been treated in the same way, an apt comment in my view. Nevertheless, he was suspended from teaching. He was then brought to trial for, quote, falsification of history, and he was condemned for falsification of history. That grants the right to determine historical truth and to punish people who deviate from historical truth as determined by the state. Typical Nazi doctrine, also a typical Stalinist doctrine, first time that it's ever been supported in the West, to my knowledge. There was a petition initiated by a well-known libertarian, Serge Tillon, in France, as the trial was coming up, asking people to call upon the tribunal to protect Faurisson's civil rights. I signed it, naturally, as I've signed petitions in much more extreme cases, I should say. This one is a trivial case. That elicited a huge outcry in France by people who, of course, it quickly became my petition, although I was one of 500 foreign signers. And in France, this elicited a huge outcry saying that I was defending his theses. Now, anyone who remembers the Enlightenment may recall that there's a distinction between supporting someone's right to his views and supporting his theses. Okay? I therefore, let's continue. Serge Tillon then asked me to respond to this confusion and to write a statement on civil liberties, which I did. I wrote a statement called Some Elementary Remarks on the Right of Freedom of Expression. I sent it to him, told him to use it as he felt, as he wanted to. He used it by adding it to a memoir written by Faurisson, which I didn't happen to know existed. The memoir was his response to the court charges for which he was brought. It's called, in English, translating it, Memoir Against Those Who Accuse Me of Falsification of History in the Matter of Gas Chambers. And I haven't actually read it, to tell you the truth, but it looks like some kind of textual analysis of some diaries by a Nazi doctor. I'm frankly not interested in his views, and I'm interested in the right of freedom of expression. My statement on civil liberties was added as an avis, an opinion, to the memoir that Faurisson submitted in response to these utterly scandalous court charges of falsification of history for which he was condemned. Now, when I heard about this, I tried to withdraw my statement. The one criticism, valid criticism of my own behavior during this period was by Christopher Hitchens in Grand Street. He pointed out that I should not have tried to withdraw my statement from the book because it should have appeared there. And I think he's right about that on civil libertarian grounds, so I apologize for that. Apart from that, I was simply taking a mild position, an obvious position, in comparison to, I might say, quite extreme positions that I've taken in defense of civil liberties, which are well known, but which never arouse any objection, showing that the critics are pure and total hypocrites who also have, either they simply support the Stalinist fascist views, but don't have courage to say so, or they are total hypocrites. For example, in 1969, at the peak of the Vietnam War, in an article which was written then and is still in print, I wrote that American war criminals should be, excuse me, that American war, you'll ask your question in a moment. We'll come back to that. That American, you'll have a question about that. I'm telling you my views on civil liberties. May I continue? May I continue to describe my views on civil liberties? My views of civil liberties, which you can look at in print, have consistently been what they were, for example, in 1969 at the peak of the Vietnam War, when I wrote that American war criminals, people like Walt Rostow, should not be denied the right to teach and to do their work, even though that work was then being used to murder and destroy on grounds of academic freedom. Now, that's an extreme view. I don't know if it can be defended, in fact, but it's an extreme view. That's far more extreme than anything in this case, since I'm aware of any objection to it. By simple logic, I conclude that the people who are raising objections in this case are either fascists or hypocrites.
Chomsky is convinced that this is the presentation of the facts, but really is quite to the otherwise. Robert Faurisson is a man who believes that Hitler has been wronged, that Hitler began World War II with some justification because he was under attack by the Jews, that the genocide of the Jews did not occur, the gas chambers did not exist, and that the reason the world thinks otherwise is because a vast Zionist conspiracy conspired beginning during World War II and continuing afterward to deceive the world. Faurisson does not take the position that he is himself a Nazi. He also believes he is not an anti-Semite. He believes many things which are absurd and untrue. Faurisson is, in France, perhaps the leading spokesman for the neo-Nazi theory of history. Chomsky just now quoted Faurisson in saying that, quoted a remark by Faurisson saying that he opposed the Nazis. Well, he has said such things in the context of the views that I repeated. The fact is, the man is a grotesque neo-Nazi historian, and Chomsky's position on this has been quite a distortion. Chomsky says that Faurisson was convicted of falsification of history. Small untruth. Faurisson was convicted of damage to the survivors. Chomsky says that Pierre Guillaume is a well-known libertarian. Excuse me, one second. I thought this question might come up, and I brought with me the most recent book published by Pierre Guillaume. It is called Le Mythe d'Auschwitz, The Myth of Auschwitz, a critical study. Pierre Guillaume is, in fact, the leading publisher of neo-Nazi history in France. He is Faurisson's publisher. He's the publisher of Wilhelm Staglich. He's the publisher of an entire series of books devoted to proving that the gas chambers are a Zionist hoax. Serge Thion is a member of Guillaume's group. Thion, one of the books. I don't care. Did I mishear the word? Guillaume, Thion. It's all the same. Thion is one of. Thion is one of the authors of the books defending the neo-Nazi theory of history. And what Chomsky has been doing is describing Thion and Guillaume as libertarians. In the Village Voice a few weeks ago, Chomsky described. And Chomsky described.
Hold down, let him finish.
Chomsky described Pierre Guillaume, this publisher, as a principled libertarian and anti-fascist. He is not. He is a species of neo-Nazi. Finally, it is not true. It is not true that Chomsky has merely defended Robert Faurisson's freedom of speech. What he has done is repeatedly add to the intellectual credibility of Faurisson. The crucial lines in the preface that he wrote, and I beg you to go read it. The crucial lines are the ones where he says, and I paraphrase, is Faurisson an anti-Semite? From what I know, he is not. Faurisson is a liberal. So wrote Noam Chomsky. In the introduction to the book published by Guillaume, the book by Faurisson proving supposedly that the gas chambers are a Zionist hoax. The facts of the case, and they're all in print, you can go look at them, are entirely to the contrary of what Chomsky would like to say.
I'm afraid I'll have to demand a point of personal privilege on this. When anyone else gets personally attacked, he will also have the right to respond, particularly with lies. First of all, the statement was made that Faurisson's views are absurd and untrue. Exactly what I've said repeatedly. I have repeatedly said that his views are diametrically opposed to my own, quoting my own view that the Holocaust was the most fantastic outburst of collective insanity in human history, and that we demean ourselves by even discussing the matter. Now, the various liars who have attempted to conceal their support for the Nazi doctrine in question have pretended, for example, to quote Paul Berman, that I made these statements only after I was pressed on the Faurisson business. What he failed to point out was that, yes, I made those statements after I was pressed on the Faurisson business, but I was quoting from the earliest essays I ever wrote, 15 years earlier, a slight distortion. And you've heard many more. So yes, Faurisson's views are absurd and untrue in my view, as I've always said, and this is totally irrelevant to the question of whether he should be condemned for falsification of history, as he was. He was brought to trial for, quote, falsification of history, which is why the memoir in question is called Memoir in Defense Against Those Who Accuse Me of Falsification of History. He was condemned for misusing documents, for not having scrupulously examined all relevant documents, for having produced historical falsehoods, and even for allowing others to use his work for nefarious ends. He was never accused of using his work for nefarious ends, but he was accused of allowing others to do so. Quite a remarkable sentencing, which aroused no protest in France, and the only reaction here has been to try to muddy the issue by claiming that those who are opposed to this reiteration of Stalinist fascist doctrine are somehow supporting his views. You got an example of that in the quote from the last paragraph, which Paul Berman has because I sent it to him, and I'll be glad to send it to anyone else. This is from my statement called Elementary Rights on the Freedom of Expression, which is mostly banalities, and rather embarrassing banalities that one shouldn't have to say after kindergarten, but apparently one does have to say, as has become clear. The last paragraph goes roughly as follows. It starts off by saying, suppose Faurisson is a raving anti-Nazi and anti-Semite as suppose he is. I say then the exact principle holds. He still has the right to expression of his views. If we only defend views of those whose attitudes are generally regarded as acceptable, what we're saying is we're opposed to free speech. The question of freedom of speech arises precisely in the case of people who have horrendous views, nowhere else. So if he is an anti-Semite and a Nazi and so on, then same conclusion holds. I then say, are the charges true? The charges are serious. And I then add, I don't know much about him, and frankly I don't care, but judging by the criticisms of him that had been sent me by his accusers, I got a whole lot of stuff from people denouncing him, and I said, judging by what has appeared about him in the French press, and judging by the statements sent by his accusers, the charge does not seem to me correct. I emphasize I don't know very much about his views, and I fundamentally don't care because it's irrelevant, but it's a serious charge and one has to establish it. And then I listed some of the charges that were made against him and pointed out that those don't amount to much and that as far as I could tell he's a relatively apolitical liberal. Now the points that Berman mentioned, which I'll come back to whether they're true or not, but they're totally irrelevant simply as a matter of logic, since at that time none of those statements had been made. So therefore it makes no difference what statement, just as it makes no difference what statement he makes tomorrow. Furthermore, the statements that had been made at the time were that he did not believe in gas chambers and that he supported those who fought the good fight against the Nazis and that he praised the heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto. That, in fact, he was not accused of being an anti-Nazi or an anti-Semite. As to Berman's own accuracy, I urge you to be careful. I just gave one example of a spectacular lie, as I did in the Village Voice, namely his claim that it was only after 1981 that I made the statements which I had written in 1969, as he knew. And another one appears in connection with Pierre Guillaume. In the answer to me, he claims, I'm quoting, that Pierre Guillaume is dedicated to what he calls in a recent newsletter a radical critique of Judaism and Jewish realities. Here is the actual sentence from which those words are taken from that issue of La Vieille Taupe, the Old Mole, tiny left-wing journal in France. Quote, "The renewal of anti-Semitism and any demonstration of anti-Semitism are the greatest enemies of the Vieille Taupe, which is dedicated to maintain its radical critique of Judaism and Jewish realities without any compromise, but also without any compromise with anti-Semitism." Out of that comes its radical critique of Judaism and Jewish realities, and he's an anti-Semite. He goes on to cite Bernard Lazare, who, as you may know, was one of the supporters of the defense of Captain Dreyfus. Bernard Lazare, who, as you may know, was one of the supporters of the defense of Captain Dreyfus.
I have a terrible problem dealing with this panel.
A little louder.
My own reaction to this panel is that it's not really dealing with the question of Israel and the American left, and I think that part of the problem is that the American left is very hard to define, and as defined by the panel, essentially exists as Walter and Howe. There's no mention of the Communist Party, any of the socialist ones, Trotskyist ones, not to mention the independent leftist reviews, much of which you can find out here. And nor does it include, apparently, the American labor movement in its vigorous forms. And this is obviously the reaction of all these different forms to Israel, its relationship with Israel, is very complex and basically hasn't been touched today. But I would like to raise a couple of points that are very important to me personally, because of views that I personally hold. And I'll try to do that very quickly. I cannot find an audience in the American left to listen to the socialist Zionist opposition in Israel. When I bring Eliezer Mir Zohar, who was at the time the director of the Kibbutz Artzi Federation, which is a very serious position and should be interesting from a feminist point of view. Not to mention the fact that seriously involved in the peace movement and social Zionist construction in Israel. I can't find an audience for her. No one will meet with her, no one will talk with her, and no one will listen to her.
when I tried to bring Yair Tzaban, a leading labor organizer, a figure really in the Israeli labor scene, or a Sephardic labor person, a person in the Jerusalem Labor Council, was trying to build Arab-Jewish cooperation. I just can't find an audience on the American left for the social Zionist opposition.
You want to comment also?
Yeah.
I didn't see her.
Remember that this was a... Okay, sorry.
All right, so let's save it. All right, we'll save up the responses to the questions and get a few, all right? I'm looking to... my eyes aren't very good. I can see lots of people, but I can't see... all the way in the back there, yeah?
It would not be a bad idea to get somebody from DSA to respond to some of Chomsky's... Unless DSA wishes to renounce any connection with socialism.
I wrote the DSA resolution that passed in 1983 at the convention. And frankly, Noam Chomsky has paid dues to DSA for several years, but apparently he doesn't read our official resolution. Let me read the resolution as closely as I can. Describe it. Right, okay. This was passed in October 1983 in the first convention of Democratic Socialists of America, the merged organization of DSOC and NAN. First, recognizing the right of both the Palestinian people to self-determination and the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, DSA supports the two-state solution in the Middle East, the Jewish state and the Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Secondly, DSA calls for negotiations between an Israeli government willing to recognize the Palestinians' right to national self-determination and between non-rejectionist elements of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That seems to me, except for the fact that we didn't say the non-rejectionist Israeli left, exactly Professor Chomsky's alleged position, which shifts somewhat, I must say, from forum to forum. But it seems to me there's not that much distinction. I would submit that there's that's DSA's position. But I do think, basically, in a certain way, there's so much bad blood for complicated historic reasons between Irving Howe and Noam Chomsky, and I think both people are somewhat personally heated and perhaps irresponsible about it. It might have been better to have the two openly, if they would, discuss the matter with each other, because it is rather ludicrous to have people, alleging positions for other people. Irving Howe did not write this, nor do I know if he supports this. This was a position passed overwhelmingly by the delegates of DSA, which supports a two-state solution in negotiations between the PLO, those who will talk to Israel, and whatever Israeli government could ever come about that would negotiate with the PLO.
Just for the sake of the record, as far as the debate between the two, Irving Howe was invited to be on this panel and declined to.
Let me explain, first of all, about the... I do think that when we're discussing the U.S. left and Israel, it is appropriate to discuss DSA, Irving Howe, Michael Walzer, the New Left, Ramparts, Liberation, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure that it's appropriate to discuss the American labor movement, but if we did, it would be overwhelmingly pro-Israel. The DSA program of October 8, 1983, which I quoted quite precisely, is a rejectionist program. It is not so rejectionist that I refuse to pay dues. Your comment that my view shifts from forum to forum is false. If you claim that it does, show it, and not just this vague denunciation of the kind that I've illustrated repeatedly. The statement that I quoted was that, and I think DSA ought to think about this, that there should be negotiations between the Israeli government and representative Palestinian leaders, including non-rejectionist elements of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, you say you want to amend it to include non-rejectionist elements of the Israeli government. The trouble is that that set happens to be zero in either party. Fine. So it's exactly, so don't tell me that don't make the statement that I falsified the thing when you agree that I quoted it accurately. As for the other statements, it calls for the Palestinian people to recognize the Jewish state of Israel as a legitimate expression of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, but it does not call upon anyone in Israel to recognize a Palestinian state as a legitimate expression of the Palestinians' people right to determination. What it calls upon is for the people of Israel to recognize the Palestinians' right to self-determination, which is a much narrower proposal and could be realized anywhere, for example, in Jordan. It could, for example, Ariel Sharon could sign this. He could say, yeah, they have a right to national self-determination in the Palestinian state, namely Jordan. That's precisely Sharon's position. So the two statements are not parallel, and therefore, although a vast improvement over DSA's earlier flat and outright rejectionism, still has a long way to go before it leaves the racist American consensus.
I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions in a row and then get some responses. Yes. I'm trying to get a balance, and I can't see that well. Are there women with their hands up? I mean, I'm just pointing. I have. Yeah, okay. No. Behind you, after.
Professor Chomsky, could you comment on the role of Israel as a theocracy and that relation to its various policies?
All right, someplace in front.
On our opening night, we all applauded a Zionist speech, and unbeknownst to most of you, when Noam Chomsky spoke about the ancient identity problems, and in dealing with all that is forced upon him, that was a Zionist speech which we all applauded. I would like you to similarly applaud when a Jew makes a similar speech about his identity problem and his need to meet them, not necessarily with a particular political arrangement. Most people deal with this issue on the basis of emotional reasons when they make up their mind, and then they are looking for the reason to substantiate it. One of the foremost American experts on rhetoric and semantics has given us an example of selective history of the American left. The American left, which I remember from that period, it was an left which applauded the Black Panthers, for instance, and the Red Guard, and the Progressive Labour Party, and you can all name them all, when they vehemently denounced Israel. People read Rampart, yes? Rampart is anti-Israel. People read in this time an excellent periodical. It's Borough. Sometimes it publishes very clear a right-wing social democrat to show how ridiculous his position is, and it often gives vent to many anti-Israeli articles, especially by European editor. Another 30 seconds. Professor Chomsky.
Let it go, come on.
My question to Professor Chomsky was what led you to spend so much of your career over the last decade or two on this issue?
Excuse me.
And to what extent...
Excuse me, this is going half an hour over time. There's another session supposed to go in here. Will you please finish your sentence? There'll be summaries by the speakers, and we're going to go into
Professor Chomsky can finish this.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you. Will the speakers please summarize, and we'll move right into the plenary session, and we can all have a drink. And remember, good is not the enemy of perfect. This happens to be the Socialist Scholars Conference and not a place for duels.
Look, just so you know, we're going to go in the opposite order of the original speaking, and they'll each speak.
Well, I'd like to talk about two questions were addressed to me. One about the question of theocracy in Israel. I'm afraid I'll refrain from that, mainly because of time. I couldn't say anything sensible in the brief time that's left. The crucial thing, however, in my view, is not so much the theocratic principle, but rather the secular principle, which I quoted. The quote I gave was from the High Court, namely that Israel is the sovereign state of the Jewish people. That's the position that much of the American left has endorsed, and that, of course, is a racist concept. We would never agree that the United States should be the sovereign state of, say, the white race or the Christians or something like that, nor would we say that England should be the... I don't agree. Well, whatever it is, Arabs aren't Jews. And whatever view you take, Arabs are not Jews, and if Arabs are allowed to be citizens of Israel and the state is the sovereign state of the Jewish people in the diaspora, but not, then it is not the state of its own citizens. And that, as Rabbi Kahana says, here I agree with him, that is flatly inconsistent with democracy. In fact, the Knesset has now even passed a motion that doesn't allow you to deny that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and no parties are allowed to participate that denies this. This is actually called an anti-racist motion, believe it or not. These are the important things. However, they don't have anything to do with Israel's right, in my view, to have exactly the rights of any state in the international system, neither more nor less. Now, I won't run through this again, but I started by saying I was giving a selective history of the left, the U.S. left, and any such history must be selective, so I didn't deal with the Fourth International and a few other things. I dealt with the mainstream, pretty much everything that's represented here. DSA, the Democratic Socialists in general, their leading spokesmen over the years, Irving Howe and Michael Walzer, the New Left as represented across a broad range, Ramparts and Liberation being the explicit ones. There are other things we didn't talk about, and I'd be glad to do it if we had time. As for that being a selective history, yes, but it's essentially an accurate history, and the point is that the charges made about the New Left everywhere, from Palo Alto to Scarsdale and so on, are just flat wrong. This is a very substantial part, certainly the dominant part, of the New Left, as it is a dominant part of the contemporary left.
Well, I think this session is a frustrating example of how difficult it is to discuss this subject on the left. I felt, for years, in sort of trying to have discussions about Israel and the Middle East and the left, that there's sort of only somehow one permissible structure for that discussion, and that's arguing about what Israel has or hasn't done. And I think we saw a variation on this today, which is called What the Left Has Had to Say About What Israel Has and Hasn't Done. And I think that there are other things. I think that there should be discussion about what Israel has and hasn't done, but I also think that there are other things to be discussed that are very important. And one of them, I think that both Paul and I, sort of from different angles, were trying to say that the question of Israel is, among many other things, one episode in the historical relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the world, and that this has many implications. One can't talk about what a Jewish state means without sort of discussing what Jews are as a dispersed people and what their history has been. One can't even discuss I think that it is not pragmatically impossible to have a state which is considered the state of the Jewish people, and also to have it be a state of its citizens, and to have Arabs have equal rights, and also to have a solution to the Palestinian problem, that there's nothing inherently impossible about this. However, there are problems and contradictions that are very obvious in this whole configuration. But I think one can't shed any light on them if one is not willing to discuss anti-Semitism and the situation of Jews, not as the only or overriding fact in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or in the Middle East conflict as a whole, but as sort of one very crucial part of the picture. And I feel like there's enormous resistance to discussing this, and I just wish there was sort of more time to talk about why I think that is, but I guess there isn't.
In answer to the comrade here, I quoted Jesse Jackson because I liked what he said about Israel and South Africa in this instance, and because I thought that he would make a very good source precisely because of the reason that no one could imagine that his general orientation was the same as mine, or that mine was the same as his. So I thought he made a good source for that. On the rest, I don't know what to say beyond what has already been said, except to point out that Chomsky's disquisition just a minute ago, where he said that the Zionist project, the idea of building Israel, is inherently racist, that this idea, the notion of Zionism boils down, it seems to me, to the notion of whether the Jews of the Middle East require an army, since that's above all what a state means. And I think to suppose that that it is inherently racist to imagine that the Jews of the Middle East are in need of an army is kind of absurd. Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of this panel. Thank you very much. There is a plenary in here now, and I guess it's going to begin fairly promptly.